Hello and good morning, everyone. We are so grateful that many of you have joined us. Before we get started, though, I want to take a moment to pay respects and express the collective grief and loss we feel for the tragedy of this weekend, the lives lost and affected from the shootings at Seattle Center, just blocks away from our coalition offices. We hold sacred space, albeit symbolically here, to lift and hold the people in our hearts. As we segue into our session today, my name is Aurora Martin, and on behalf of Front and Centered and our coalition, welcome to our virtual briefing. Front and Centered is a coalition of nearly 100 community organizations across the state. Collectively, our community organizations, their missions and work are diverse, touching the lives of tens of thousands of people living on the front lines. Our organizations serve working families living near Superfund sites to communities in urban food deserts or in rural communities whose community infrastructures are strained for energy and water access, and the farm workers harvesting through wildfire smoke. Because of these frontline issues, Front and Centered was formed because we know that while we see the rapid transition of our economy driven by technological, labor, and environmental and climate changes, the transitions may be inevitable, but justice is not. And so for Front and Centered, when it comes to environmental and climate justice, our charge as a statewide support team is to advance the rights and expand the resources and transform relationships. We have advanced the Healthy Environment for All Act, contributed towards the development of the Environmental Health Disparities Map, piloted rapid reporting tools for environmental hazards, and developed community education for so many community leaders who are now providing insight and input for agency rules. Today, our focus is one of the biggest headline issues affecting people and planet: data centers. The rapid nature of data center buildouts, especially hyperscale data centers, is at such a fast pace that the cumulative impacts on people and planet have not fully been understood. And what are the costs and the benefits to people and planet, especially for the people who will live and work and breathe the impacts of data centers? And so our role at Front and Centered is to ask the questions, with a special focus on communities centered. Today, we share our latest report with the public community-centered frontline perspectives on hyperscale data centers in Washington state. You will hear how the concerns expressed from community interviews highlight the concerns about the need for meaningful involvement in the process of planning for such data centers. Why? Because there are serious concerns and unanswered questions that relate to the cumulative impacts on health from pollution, water and energy infrastructure, and pressures on affordability and access. Aksa?
Thank you, Aurora. Next slide, please. And as we get started, I wanted to just take a minute to introduce to everyone the project team that has worked very hard on the research and writing of this report. It definitely took a lot of other people as well, but wanted to just quickly introduce our authors for this report. My name is Aksa Mengo, and I am the Energy Policy Lead here at Front and Centered, and I lead our energy justice work for the coalition. Jamie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jamie Hearn. I use she, her pronouns, and I am Front and Centered's Policy Counsel, and I work on a wide range of climate and environmental justice policy issues. And I'll pass it to Leah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Wood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Community Innovation, Evaluation, and Learning Lead, and I support with our community-driven research, evaluation, and assessment. Thank you.
Thank you both. And as we get started, I want to start off with a bit of grounding and context for why we embarked on this project and why we decided to conduct this research, and essentially what we hope that this research and this report will achieve in the broader conversation regarding data centers. And I think it's important to sort of level set on the fact that we are hearing a lot about data centers, but there hasn't been enough attention paid to community perspectives, particularly in frontline communities, on how data centers are disproportionately impacting the health, well-being, and livelihoods of frontline communities. And so that is the overarching question that we had in mind as we decided to conduct the research for this report, and that is what you will see encapsulated in the final report. Next slide, please. And I think this sort of illustration provides a good understanding of what our goal was for this research, which was essentially to look at the topic of impacts from hyperscale data centers from many different angles and to tell a fuller story, one where frontline communities are at the center of what is happening and the impacts that they are seeing. Next slide, please. Thanks. And I will now turn it over to my colleagues to cover the rest of our section.
Thanks, Aksa. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, we want to spend a minute talking about language and some of the language that we use in this report. Data centers have existed for decades, though never at the size and scale of what we're seeing in recent years, and for different uses. So for reference, today's hyperscale data centers use roughly 10 times the energy of data centers from 10 years ago. We want to be clear that when we talk about data centers in this briefing and in the report, we are primarily talking about hyperscale data centers, which are necessary to run generative AI tools and are resource intensive in ways earlier versions are not. Next slide, please. So we set out to learn from frontline community organizations, grassroots groups, and advocates about what they're seeing on the ground and what they are concerned about. We spoke to 28 different community-based organizations from around the state who are based in at least 16 municipalities, though many do work outside of their office locations as well. And you can see some of their office locations on this map. And we talked about what's happening in their communities, their concerns, and their priorities, and what resources they feel like they need. Next slide, please. We used an iterative approach to this research, so starting with background research, which helped inform our interview questions, which then in turn informed additional research and inquiry. And so you can see this kind of loop of how we worked to kind of circle back on what we were learning. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass it to Jamie to introduce our speakers, who will share a little bit more.
So we are really excited to have some of the folks that we were able to speak to as we were doing our research and conducting this report. We just really want to emphasize that the work that we've been able to do has really been because of the community leaders that were so generous with their time and their wisdom and sharing their lived experiences with us, and that has really been foundational to this entire project. And so we are very grateful to both Juan and Sibo for joining us today. Juan Monje is the community organizer for Columbia Riverkeeper, and Sibo Chadiwa is also here, and she is a program manager at Immigrant Guide. And so we are going to start with Juan today and just give him some space to share his own thoughts and experiences about this issue, and then we will pass it off to Sibo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Monje. I'm the community organizer for Columbia Riverkeeper. I work primarily in Southwest Washington and the Columbia River Gorge, where I'm engaged with residents, students, and faith leaders and community organizations on environmental issues that directly affect their lives. Over the past year, one of the biggest changes I have seen in the growing concern about the rapid expansion of the data centers and other projects that needed to power them. Many people are hearing about this project for the first time after major decisions have already been made. They want to understand how this project could affect the community, the electricity costs, water resources, public health, and the Columbia River. I've had conversations with families, tribal partners, educators, local leaders, and community members in both in English and Spanish. Something in common is that people want to be included early in the decision-making process. They want information that is easy to understand in their language and share before the decisions are taken, not after. Another important issue is environmental justice. Communities that have historically had less access to information or fewer opportunities to participate should not be left behind as Washington plans for future energy needs. Everyone deserves opportunity to ask questions, share concerns, and help shape decisions that will affect the neighborhood for generations. At the state policy level, I hope that we continue to be more transparent, help the community have more engagement early in the process, ensuring that the benefits for the new energy project are shared fairly. We also need to protect our river, fish, tribal rights, and the communities that depend on them while planning for future economic growth. Thank you for the opportunity to share what we are seeing on the ground. I look forward to continuing this conversation and working together towards solutions that are going to benefit our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan, for sharing your experiences with data centers. And for folks who are interested in learning more about Columbia Riverkeeper and their work, there is a link in the chat. Now I'm going to pass it to Sibo.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And good morning, everyone. My name is Sibongile Churchgiwa, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a Black Zimbabwean woman with curly hair. I serve as the program manager for Immigrant Guide. And so I work alongside immigrant and refugee communities across Washington state. When people hear the words data center, they often think about technology, artificial intelligence, or economic growth. But the families I work with think about something much more immediate. Will this affect my utility bill? Can I still afford to keep my lights on? One story has stayed with me. A woman in our community experienced serious complications during childbirth, and she spent an extended period in the hospital. When she finally returned home, she discovered her electricity had been disconnected because she could not keep up with her bills while she was hospitalized. As a community, we came together and raised money to try to get her power turned back on. This was when she had a brand new child and recovery to worry about. This experience reminds me that for many immigrant and refugee families, utility bills are not just another monthly expense. They mean having lights, refrigeration for your food and medication, clean water, clean laundry, and a safe place to come home to. Many families are already struggling and having to make impossible choice between paying for their electricity versus buying groceries versus covering rent or meeting other essential needs. That's why conversations about data center matter. I'm not opposed to technology or innovation. Washington benefits from both. But growth should never come at the expense of families who are already struggling to make ends meet. As our state plans for the future, I hope we prioritize protecting residential ratepayers, ensuring that the costs of major infrastructure investments are shared fairly, and giving communities a meaningful voice before decisions are made. Frontline communities deserve transparency, genuine engagement, and the opportunity to help shape the policies that affect their own lives. Washington State has the opportunity to lead by showing that innovation and environmental justice can go hand in hand. We don't have to choose between economic growth and healthy, affordable communities. If we keep people at the center of these conversations, I believe we can achieve both. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibo. I just want to, before we get into our findings and our policy recommendations, I want to again just iterate that, this work was really made possible because of community leaders like Juan and Sibo, who are just who represent two of the community organizations out of 29 that we were able to talk to across the state. And the sentiments that they shared just now are really important reminders for us that when we're talking about data centers, we're not talking about, abstract policy. We're talking about the impacts to people's lives, and clean water and clean air and the ability to participate in decision-making processes are really important parts of how we are ensuring that our most vulnerable communities are able to live safe and healthy lives. So can we move to the next slide, please? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the framing and high-level themes from our findings, and I'll pass it back over to Leah to get a little more in-depth on those. Next slide, please. So from all of the interviews that we were able to do, two main themes emerged. The first being around cumulative impacts. And cumulative impacts are about the totality of exposures to combinations of chemical and non-chemical stressors and their impacts on health, well-being, and quality of life outcomes. And that is a kind of technical way to say that we need to be thinking about the ways that all of these different environmental and socioeconomic factors can compound to create disparate impacts on communities who are already dealing with higher levels of pollution and health impacts. And the second main theme is around meaningful involvement. You've heard from Sibo and Juan a little bit about this, but it is really about the ways that governmental entities can include the public in these decision-making processes and making sure that these processes are as inclusive and accessible as possible so that we are really involving the people who are going to be the most impacted by these decisions. Next slide, please. So another important piece about this for framing is about environmental justice. This quote on screen right now is pulled from Washington's Healthy Environment for All Act. And the themes that emerged were really important to us because they are both really core components of what environmental justice means for our communities. And so part of environmental justice is about making sure that people are being treated fairly and that meaningful involvement is happening for everyone, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And this is specifically in regards to development, implementation, and enforcement of different environmental laws, rules, and policies. And another component of this is making sure that we address these disproportionate health and environmental impacts in all of our laws and rules and policies. And this requires that we prioritize vulnerable populations and overburdened communities because we know that these are the communities that are being harmed. And it's also about the equitable distribution of resources and benefits, and also about the active elimination of these harms. Next slide, please. And so just to kind of sum it up before I pass it over to Leah to go into the findings, We found through our interviews that frontline communities are not only being disproportionately burdened by the multiple cumulative impacts of data center projects, but they also face the greatest challenges around meaningfully engaging in these decision-making processes about the projects that are impacting them. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to pass it to Leah.
Awesome, thank you. So before we jump into what we learned through our conversations, I wanted to share a little bit of data around how cumulative impacts are showing up when it comes to data centers in Washington State. So we compiled a list of 81 data centers using 5 publicly available data sets and compared their locations by the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map rankings. And this is a cumulative impacts tool that we use in our state. I want to note that there is no one list of data center locations in Washington, which is why we had to bring together 5 publicly available data sets. It's really hard to find information on this. So we found that data centers are more likely to be located in areas already burdened by environmental health disparities. And next slide, please. Moreover, we found that race has a significant relationship with data center locations, even more so than poverty. This raises alarms for us in thinking about disproportionate impact to communities of color who have historically borne the burden of environmental injustice. Next slide, please. So to illustrate this a little bit more, I'll now share some of the findings from our conversations with our community leaders. There's a lot that we don't know about the long-term environmental and health impacts of data centers, but we know enough about pollution and exposures caused by data centers to be wary. Community leaders shared concern and observations of data centers impacting environmental quality, including pollution of air, water, soil, noise, and heat, and associated health impacts like asthma, skin and eye irritation, and cancer, among others, not to mention the impacts to social determinants of health. In particular, our interviewees spoke to the pollution caused by diesel backup generators, which are used to power data centers during energy outages, and concern about fossil fuel-powered energy generation, which we'll get into. Larger data centers can also use up to 5 million gallons per day of water, or the rough equivalent of a town with a population of 10,000 to 50,000 people. If we continue to build at the current rate, by 2030, it's estimated that data centers will have the same water consumption per day as the city of New York. This can cause significant water burden, especially when we consider that since 2022, an estimated 2/3 of data centers have been sited in high water stress areas. And this is of key concern to the people that we spoke to. There are ways to reduce water consumption, which is primarily used by evaporative cooling of servers, but these are often more expensive and there isn't a lot of incentive for developers to implement these strategies. Next slide, please. Almost all of the community leaders we interviewed were concerned about how the energy consumption of data centers will impact our energy systems and availability for communities. Data centers currently account for roughly 11% of Washington's energy consumption, and it's estimated that up to 90 gigawatts worth of data centers could come online in the US by 2030. This is about 9 times New York City's peak summer demand being added to the national grid in less than 5 years. In May 2026, so only a few months ago, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, issued a level 3 alert, which signals immediate and significant stress on our grid stability, so a red alert essentially, in large part due to the surge of large power consumers like data centers. As we make updates to the grid to accommodate this demand, the question arises of who's going to pay for this, because we often see this translating to our consumers, to our households. We don't have information on Washington State. However, a recent analysis of wholesale electricity prices across the US showed that in areas with high data center activity and build-out, electricity cost as much as 267% more per single month than what it did 5 years ago. And this raises concerns for the roughly 270,000 Washington households who are already energy burdened. Next slide, please. Several of our community leaders shared concern that Washington is already at risk of not meeting our goal of reaching 100% renewable energy generation by 2045 under CETA, or the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and that rapid increases in energy demand due to data centers will make it even more difficult to meet this goal. Electricity demand in our state is expected to increase 83% by 2050, which will require build-out of additional power plants, and we're concerned that this also includes fossil fuel if we're not able to meet that demand. For example, up until last week, there were plans to build 14 additional natural gas generators in the town of Quincy, which has at least 21 data centers to power some of these data centers. Next slide, please. We don't have great information on job creation and economic benefits associated with data centers. However, an audit found that between 2015 and 2019, Washington State gave $266 million in tax breaks to data centers with a combined job creation requirement of only 260 jobs, meaning $200,000 annually in tax breaks for each of the jobs created if they were created during that time. Since 2018, we've given a cumulative $790 million in tax breaks to data centers, with almost $200 million in 2025 alone, which could probably create a lot of jobs. Most of the jobs created are temporary construction jobs, which keep our tradespeople employed, and this is important, but it does little to support local communities in the long term. This also corresponds with elimination of jobs due to AI. In Washington, we've seen over 24,000 tech job layoffs just since 2023. Community leaders also highlighted fears of displacement and how data centers and supporting energy infrastructure could eat up available land that could otherwise serve the community or be used for other uses. In Quincy, Washington, like I mentioned, where we have a ton of data centers already, 34 families are currently at risk of losing their land and are being offered a fraction of the fair market value to make room for additional transmission lines to double the town's energy capacity. Currently, data centers use 37% of energy in that county. Next slide, please. So as we shift from talking about cumulative impacts, we now talk about the need for meaningful involvement of our communities. I want to also talk about the need for upholding tribal sovereignty through practicing of free, prior, and informed consent. So following a similar trend to fossil fuel development and other extractive industries, we are seeing tribal land being targeted by developers for data center projects and energy infrastructure needed to power them. Tribes retain the inherent right to make decisions over their land. Tribal engagement around these projects often happens too little, too late, and we need to honor and uphold tribal sovereignty and principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And so some of the tribal nations in our state have already been really outspoken on this issue. In particular, we want to highlight recommendations by the Yakama Nation for statewide data center strategy. And so we can put that in the chat. We also heard from our community leaders that the emerging, always changing nature of data centers makes them difficult to regulate using existing frameworks, which are often reactive, slow moving, and unable to address the data center's impacts. We also see overlapping authority between local, state, federal, and tribal jurisdictions. And so it's often difficult because of the many layers there to figure out where to address the issue. Next slide, please. Community leaders described how the race to develop projects meant that the process often outpaced their ability to educate and mobilize impacted community members. In particular, we're seeing a trend towards expedited permitting processes and general orders for both data centers and supporting energy infrastructure that leaves little room for community engagement. While there's a significant need for more clean and affordable energy in Washington state, the need must not be used to justify processes that replicate exclusionary land use decisions used in the past to perpetuate environmental racism, particularly if new clean resources are being used to power these hyperscale data centers. Our community leaders also shared the difficulties in finding and accessing information and how many people aren't aware of projects planned or built in their neighborhoods, let alone have the time and capacity to mobilize. They shared frustration with the lack of accessibility and engagement opportunities describing how hearings and meetings are scheduled at times community members can't attend. They often use inaccessible jargon and technical language, and they only provide materials written in English, not the languages spoken by communities. Next slide, please. So our interviewees shared experiences of seeing tech companies and developers misrepresent potential impacts of data centers. In particular, interviewees described the use of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, to obscure details about projects and concerns about the outsized wealth and political power of tech companies. Tech companies also benefit from additional security around federal contracts with the military. Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, which are all companies that have hyperscale data centers in Washington, have ties to military use and are able to evade disclosure requirements and have heightened security around the details of their projects. We need to build the narrative of who is benefiting from these data centers and who is harmed and how. So it's not just about the environmental impacts of these or the energy impacts, but also the ways in which the technology for these centers may be used to harm communities across the globe. The connection between data centers, which are the physical infrastructure of generative AI, and the technology they power feels abstract to many. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. When you pull the curtain back, however, you can see how the relationship between data centers, military surveillance, and immigration enforcement impacts frontline communities across the globe and locally. Tech companies have openly worked with the US military for a decade on Project Maven, which uses generative AI to comb through surveillance data to more accurately identify and kill people and make combat operations for drone warfare cheaper. Interviewees expressed concerns over how data centers are powering AI that is used to support immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, allowing them to monitor and target communities by processing vast quantities of surveillance data. And so it's these other harms that need to be accounted for as well. Next slide, please. And here's a quote from one of our interviewees about concerns around outsized power of data center companies. And I'll pass it back to my colleagues. Thank you.
Great. So next slide, please. So I'm going to be going over some of the policy recommendations that we put together as a result of the findings that Leah just went over based on the conversations that we had with our community leaders and community organizations. Next slide, please. So the first of those is a moratorium on new data centers. A statewide moratorium at this moment is really necessary to allow us to really assess what the long-term impacts are of these types of facilities. Like Leah mentioned, going through our findings, because of the rapid pace of the way this build out is happening, and because, we just don't really know what the impacts are on a long term, a moratorium would allow us to really take a moment to consider who is benefiting from these processes, who is benefiting from these facilities, and are there ways to make sure that community voices are really being centered as, we think about what future development for the state of Washington is going to look like moving forward. Next slide, please. So some other policy recommendations that we have are focused on the regulation of existing data centers. So one of those is around legally binding community benefits. So if a project is to move forward in a community, it's really important that the local community be guaranteed these types of benefits that are promised to them, whether that be through a memorandum of understanding or a community benefit agreement or a community benefits ordinance. The main thing that we are advocating for coming out of these types of agreements is that it be something that is legally enforceable. So if a developer is not living up to their commitments, there is a path for recourse for the local communities. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about policy recommendations related to energy. So the first is that tech companies and developers should be responsible for paying for the required energy infrastructure, which includes upgrades, maintenance, generation, storage, and transmission of clean energy to support this increased demand. And it's really important that there isn't a way for these facilities to pass the costs of energy usage on to ratepayers or local communities. Another important part of that is making sure that data centers are being required to use an electricity supply that is powered by renewables and is free of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, in alignment with existing laws in Washington state, like the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And one thing we really heard from our interviewees is that it's really important to not backslide on some of our decarbonization goals and requirements because of this increased demand. Next slide, please. So other policy recommendations include making sure that there is funding that is paid for by developers for ongoing environmental monitoring of data center projects. It's not enough to just do an initial environmental assessment and then the facility is good to go. It's really important that we're tracking how these facilities are impacting communities over time as they continue operating. It's also really important that we assess the potential cumulative impacts of these facilities, and resulting from that assessment, think about how mitigation could look like for these local communities, and that both of these, both the cumulative impact assessment and consideration of mitigation be a part of formal permitting processes. It's also really important that there is early, transparent, and consistent engagement with frontline communities. And it is also very important that tribal involvement happen at the start of project development. And not just that this community involvement is happening, but that the involvement that does happen is accessible, and that it is including education and engagement that really centers the unique needs of the specific communities that are being impacted. Next slide, please. So another policy recommendation we have is around tax incentives. As many of you probably know, Washington took a really important first step in this past session to repeal some of the tax incentives that data centers receive. But ultimately, it's really important that these developers and facility owners be responsible for all of the costs that are associated with construction, operation, and maintenance. And this would require repealing their eligibility for all state tax breaks so that our communities are no longer being forced to help cover the costs. And it is also very important that data center owners and developers exercise transparency and accountability in project siting, planning, and construction. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pass it over to Aksa to talk about our next steps and opportunities for engagement.
Thanks, Jamie. I would now like to cover some of the upcoming advocacy opportunities, both on the community education and capacity building side of things, but also on the legislative front that we have that are coming up. And a lot of these are directly in response to the great feedback that we heard from the several organizations and community leaders that we spoke to for this research. And so we hope that these directly feed into the community needs that were identified as part of this research. Next slide, please. So the first bucket of opportunities that I want to cover that we have coming up are on community education and capacity building. And the first one is a public webinar series called Shifting Power on Data Centers that Front and Centered and the Northwest Energy Coalition are jointly hosting over the next several months. We have 3 webinars. 2 of these will be live and available on Zoom for folks to join in on, and one of them that will be recorded and then available for viewing to the public later on. Our first webinar is going to be on August 19th, titled Data Centers 101, where we cover the basics of what we mean by data centers, hyperscale data centers, the difference between different types of data center facilities, and how and why we think data centers are a climate and environmental justice issue. Again, this is Wednesday, August 19th, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. And you are able to register for that if you haven't already done so. Our second webinar, which will be in October, is going to focus on data centers and energy affordability. This will not be available to join live, but we will include a recording of the event and share for folks to watch later on. And then our third webinar in this series is going to be on data centers and water justice, which will be on Tuesday, November 10th. This will be a live webinar from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. and closer to the date, we will share more information about how to register for this. And so, yeah, this is the first sort of series of events in our community education and capacity building bucket. And this is a public webinar series. Next slide, please. And the other offering that I'd like to cover, which is also part of our community education and capacity building bucket, is a energy justice leadership program, specifically which will focus on data centers. And this is the first time that we are launching this program, and so the 2026 to 27 cohort of folks will be the inaugural cohort for this program. And what this leadership program is essentially, it is a program that supports participants in building skills and capacity to advocate for their community's energy needs, and engage more deeply around movement building regarding energy justice. This first iteration of the program, as I mentioned, is going to focus on knowledge exchange and advocacy related to the build out of hyperscale data centers in Washington. As I mentioned, directly in response to the wonderful feedback that we heard from community leaders around the gaps that they currently recognize that they would like to be filled. This 2026 to 2027 cohort will run for 6 months, starting in September 2026 all the way until February 2027. And it will include a mix of in-person and virtual programming. And lastly, participation in this leadership program is compensated for folks that are selected. We will provide a $500 stipend for the duration of the program. And there's also availability for additional travel funding based on where you are located in Washington State. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to cover some of our upcoming advocacy efforts on the legislative front. And these are both proposals or bills that have either already been proposed or will be proposed that Front and Centered is very actively supporting or advocating for. The first one is the Washington Energy Affordability Act, which is a legislative proposal to advance energy affordability and protections for households in the face of rapid data center demand growth and ensure transparency. This bill will essentially place a fee on hyperscale data center energy usage, with funds being channeled towards energy assistance, weatherization, and home energy upgrades for energy burdened and low-income households. If you are interested in learning more about this work or would like to support, please reach out to Linda Garcia at the Washington State Community Action Partnership, and that is Linda's email noted right there. The other piece of our legislative advocacy that I would like to cover is House Bill 2515. House Bill 2515 was a bill that focused on regulating data centers that was introduced during the 2025 legislative session, which Front and Centered supported. And while this bill did not encompass all of the protections that we know our communities need. We are supportive of data center regulations like House Bill 2515 that focus on water usage, energy grid impacts, and stricter reporting requirements. Next slide, please. And yeah, that wraps up our sort of overview of what we have for you in this report. That was a very high-level, quick overview of what's there, what you can expect, the findings, themes, our methodology. And now that the report is finally live, we would love for you all to take some time to review it yourselves. Please share any feedback or thoughts that you have with us. This has been a labor of love for all of us and all of the wonderful community leaders that we have spoken to for this research. And so we invite you to take a look at the report in your own time. Next slide, please. And in the remaining 11 minutes that we have, we're now going to open it up to questions for the audience. I know there's a lot of great questions that are already in the Q&A feature or in the chat, but if you have any additional questions and haven't had a chance to drop them in yet, please feel free to do so. You can either add your question directly to the Q&A feature, or you can drop it in the chat and we'll make sure to cover those for you. I'm going to get started with some of the questions that we already have had that have been coming up during the webinar. All right. We have a question from Pablo, which says, you said that you are focused on talking about hyperscale data centers. Does your observation about race factors hold true even as those data center projects seek to deploy in more and more rural locations? Put another way, are the planners and developers still targeting BIPOC communities as they shift from suburban and urban footprints to ex-urban, rural, and even wild spaces?
I can step in and try to answer this. So, Pablo, this is a great question, and kind of as a short answer is I don't really know, because we didn't look into the trends specifically. We do see clusters of data centers interstate in places like Quincy, East Wenatchee, Malaga, Tri-Cities, and Tukwila, which are all areas with high proportions of people of color. So I don't know if we can say anything definitively about targeting, but we do see evidence of disproportionate impact to communities of color. But this is a really good question, and one that we can do some thinking around how we would look more into. Thanks for raising it.
Thanks, Leah. Our next question is from Michelle regarding tax breaks. So in addition to repealing tax breaks, has there been talk about implementing additional taxes, similar to how cigarettes are taxed at a higher rate? Front and center team thoughts, or this is something that we can also always circle back with you on, Michelle?
Yeah, I can. Excuse us. There's definitely some movement there about specific taxes that data centers could pay. There hasn't been anything that has been firmly proposed that I've seen that is thinking about taxing them a certain rate to fill certain budget buckets, if that's local, regional, or statewide. But I think it's definitely something we're interested in to see how data centers could potentially fund some of local energy assistance projects or weatherization projects. But there's nothing firm at the moment.
Thanks, Guillermo. Another question that we have is around legislative advocacy and bill proposals. So will Front and Center pursue a bill or bills for these policy recommendations during the next legislative session?
Yeah, the short answer for that is yes. House Bill 2515 from last year, which was aiming to regulate data centers, will be returning in some form. I can't say fully what that bill is going to be or what it's going to encompass, but we're going to find out more as the session gets closer. And then some of these proposals that we have included in our legislative recommendations, we're starting up those conversations. So if y'all are interested in joining some of those stakeholder conversations or just chatting with us one-on-one, I could drop my email so we can connect.
Thanks, Guillermo. Our next question is from Jewel regarding water usage. So is there a way to show what 6% means? How many gallons of water is that? We need to be specific with people.
This is a really good question, Jewel. I don't know if I have an exact like metaphor here or example, but this is really helpful feedback as we're thinking about maybe like the water justice and data centers webinar that we have coming up. So thanks for that feedback. And I'll pass it to the team if anyone else has any ideas here.
Thanks, Leah. And I think that's a great idea. That's definitely something, Jewel, that we can account for in our webinar on water justice and data centers and make sure that we have clear ways to visualize and convey that to the public. So thank you for that. Our next question is from Kristen. Thank you for presenting. Have you been in conversation with Central Washington, where data centers are highly concentrated? The local government leaders there feel that data centers are done the right way there and benefit their community. Thoughts from the FC team? This is also a question that we can circle back on with Kristen.
I'm sorry, Aksa, do you mind putting that in the chat or saying that one more time?
Yeah, I can repeat it. I'm not sure where there's a lot going on in the chat, but I can repeat the question. Let's take a look. Have we been in conversation with Central Washington, where data centers are highly concentrated? The local government leaders there feel that data centers are done the right way and that they benefit their community.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at this. So yes, we have been in conversation with some people in Central Washington, including in the Quincy area, where I know there's been a lot of news about. So I would say that there are a lot of different opinions on data centers. And yes, we have been in conversation, and those perspectives helped inform our report. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. We have a question from Johnny, which asks, I believe I heard that something on the Yakama Nation, something that the Yakama Nation is doing regarding data centers would be added to the chat. FC team, this might be referring to the report by the Yakama Nation on the data center work group. If we're able to drop that into the chat, that would be great. Thanks, Leah. We have a question from Emily regarding transmission lines. So another funding question. Could the efforts to upgrade our electricity transmission lines also be linked to fees on data centers? Has there been interest in that? That is a wonderful question, Emily. Thank you for asking that. If you are asking about this question in the context of the legislative proposal that I was discussing on energy affordability, this has not been part of that conversation. The funding that is the funding buckets that are being proposed as part of that bill proposal specifically focus on energy assistance, on low-income weatherization, and then low-income energy efficiency upgrades. But outside of Washington, there are lots of other states that are working on legislative advocacy and ways to sort of tie infrastructure upgrades, and that includes transmission lines and the grid to something that data centers would have to pay for. I will reference Oregon's Power Act that passed last year that includes some provisions around this, and we'd be happy to follow up with you and share some information from other contexts that we've heard about that are pursuing and calling for data centers to cover some of these other infrastructure and upgrade costs as well. So thank you for asking that question. Great question. Okay, we have a lot of great questions. I'm going to cover one last question, given that we're almost out of time. And for folks whose questions we have not been able to cover, we will follow up with you and answer those. Mia asks, will you all be creating any one-pagers or infographics that we can share with our communities? Yes, Mia, we are definitely planning to do that. As part of our public webinar series and the Energy Justice Leadership Program, we're going to be creating a range of different resources, including an advocacy toolkit, a one-pager on data centers and energy affordability, and a one-pager on data centers and water justice, and then also a toolkit on legislative advocacy that communities can use to advocate for their community's needs and concerns when it comes to data centers. So we will have a whole host of resources that are going to be published over the next 6 to 7 months, and those will be included on Front and Center's website under our data centers page, and we'll share that more broadly in our public communications as well. And that is all we have for you today. Next slide, please. Just want to say, yeah, a huge thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Really, really grateful for your insightful questions. And we look forward to you all taking a look at the report. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions, feedback, thoughts, follow-ups about our work. And yeah, just really grateful for your participation, and we hope to continue doing this work in solidarity with you all and with our communities here in the state. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.